could have you all take a seat. My name is John Wilson. I'm president of the hydrology section of AGU, and it's my pleasure today to introduce the Langbein lecturer for 2008, Bill Dietrich of UC Berkeley. Bill did his undergraduate degree in Occidental, did the graduate work at the University of Washington, and of course is now at Berkeley. Bill, as you know, is a leader in geomorphology. He's actively promoted LIDAR and the development of INCOM, the National Center for Airborne Laser Commanding. He's PI in INSET, that's the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics at St. Anthony Falls Lab in Minnesota. But what we know him best for is his work, and he has studied topics ranging from landscape signatures of life, to bedload transport, to the integration of weathering science into geomorphology. He does synthesis. These accomplishments have been widely recognized by AGU and others, and by the National Academy of Sciences, which he was elected to. Finally, as you'll see, Bill is an energetic and engaging speaker. The topic today is geomorphology, the shock of the familiar.
Well, thank you, John. I'm feel very fortunate to have the opportunity and the honor to speak to my many friends and many colleagues in this Langbein lecture series. Now, I've chosen a peculiar title for a particular reason. Geomorphology is something everyone experiences. We live, work, and play on landscapes whose form, dynamics, and even the smell of which defines what we call home. Introductory textbooks confidently write about water runs downhill, rivers meanders, hill slopes erode. It all seems pretty understandable, familiar, even known. Here I want to take you on a personal journey. And it's a journey that will take you beyond, in a way, that familiar landscape. In some ways, you might say, look behind the curtain that we see in this familiar landscape. It is a journey that began when Tom Dunn, in 1974, introduced me to the field of geomorphology when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington. And nearly everything I'm going to talk about today has been discovered since then. And for me, I'm going to point to several shocks of what has been discovered and what the field itself has become. It is a journey that has followed many footsteps, most notably here in this lecture series, that by Walter Langbein, whose feet and legs are shown here experiencing Horton overland flow. And if you look closely, he's clearly soaked. He must have been having a great time. So, the shock of the familiar. 4 shocks. The first is the ubiquity of topographic forms, repeated landforms found at all scales, on all sorts of places. The second is the shock that when we write a simple conservation equation of mass, how difficult it is to solve it, and how little we know about it, and the shock of trying to get answers for it. The third shock comes from the discovery that surface erosion can dictate the large-scale force balances of tectonic plates when they collide, and can affect the height, width, and symmetry of mountains. Simple surface erosion. In a curious sort of way, a tree might matter to the shape of a mountain range. And the final shock is this one. Web of Science, just type in the word geomorphology and look at the number of publications. This field is undergoing a revolution in activity. So the first shock I want to share with you, and is going to lead to a tension of 2 sort of contrasting goals. And that shock is the surface topography is surprisingly similar across the Earth's terrestrial surface, under the ocean, and on other planets. And I'm going to mention ridge and valley topography, convex hilltops, valley networks, and meandering to illustrate this idea. So here are 3 landscapes, all of which were created, images were created in the last 10 years, shaded relief images of topography. One was from the INCOM Center near the San Andreas Fault. Another is under about 3,000 meters of water in the ocean, and a third is on Mars. And they have a remarkable similarity to them. There is a topography of ridge and valley that expresses itself repeatedly. And the ridges between the valleys are rounded or convex up. If we look at a photograph, we can go to the ends of the Earth. Here's the Atacama Desert in Chile, very beautifully rounded hilltops. We can contrast that with the Columbia Hills on Mars. Taylor Perrin did change the colors on this to make it more familiar. But I will comment that this is truly the shock of the familiar. The images that are coming back from Mars, from the rovers, from the HiRISE project, show us a landscape that seems familiar, that has convex hilltops, that has ridge and valley topography, that has meandering channels. If you look at a topographic map without a scale, you cannot tell the scale of the feature. Here are 4 panels, in which one of which is 14 meters across and the other is 3.2 kilometers across. Can you tell which is which? If you look at the image to the right here, or to the left, excuse me, you'll see a molded relief with a finger pointing at it. That's the Appalachians. At that scale, there's ridge and valley topography, but that's not the scale at which those features are expressed. If I lift my finger, we see underneath it a fine scale dissection, but a finite scale dissection of the landscape. Landscapes then consist of ridge and valley topography, but only at the finest scale do we see revealed the actual valley network, and that defines some transition between a hillslope and valley. So when we core scale up maps, when we have SRTM data, we are seeing ridge and valley topography, but underneath those grand coarse grids is another scale, but up to some limit. So have you made up your mind yet? Which is the 14 meters across and which is the 3.2 kilometers across? There's the answer. Channel networks, though, are of finite extent. At some point, the remaining area we could call a hillslope. There is a spacing between these channels, and we can reason that somehow there's some competition of cutting down versus smoothing that will set up that spacing. And the slopes between the finite extent of the channel network is what I call a hillslope. We might call a fundamental hillslope to make it distinctive. It's that landscape that lacks further division. So when we look at now a landscape formed by other means, and now I have to find the, can anybody, there we are. In this case, a sandbox experiment, 30 centimeters across, in which a mist of rain is added, and our colleagues in France document the evolution of landscape, the development of a valley network. Is the sandbox same as a large landscape? Does the tendency to develop ridge and valley topography have here the way it happens, the relative geometry? Is it relevant to large-scale landscapes? We see a beautiful story here of uplift, constant state of uplift, and then lack of uplift in the retreated landscapes. How do we compare natural landscapes to these sandbox realities? There's a very nice discussion about this by Hancock and Wilgoose in 2001 in Water Resources Research about this issue. Oops, let's see, I'll try going over here. For those of you who know me, I have my presentation on a Mac, and I'm used to a PC, so I might end up going backwards. So, Leopold and Langbein in 1962 were attracted to this issue of the similarity of landscapes and importantly, in this case, the common characteristics of channel networks often described by Horton's laws. And they brought forward this idea of some random process and some minimum energy expenditure could lead to this commonality that we see in landscapes. 35 years later, Rodriguez Iturbe and Andre Rinaldo wrote a substantial volume that gave us the persuasive argument for the pursuit of the generality, the general features of landscapes by some general principles of random interactions and energy minimization. But if we look across at this landscape over here, another sandbox experiment, how do I decide that what goes on here is relevant to natural processes? How do I understand whether the sandbox experiment is about the sandbox or about landscapes in general? Well, Jeff Neiman and Les Harbargen, Les having done experiments, examined this, and they actually, by careful examination, detect three attributes of these channel networks that really are different from what we might consider might be the general attributes of natural landscapes. We are looking for these metrics of distinction, not so much metrics of similarity then. When a numerical model is made, as Alan Howard did and Will Goose did in the 90s and many have done since then, we get wonderful ridge and valley topography. Is this representative of natural landscapes? What metrics do we use to compare the results of numerical models with natural landscapes? And how do we accept or reject these models? When we look at a watershed like this, I use watershed in quotes because this is off the shore of Monterey, I find this shocking. I feel very comfortable before I was told this was underneath Monterey that I could start talking to you about the erosional processes responsible for there. But now I've got to rethink this, a different set of processes that at least qualitatively look similar, but we are looking to see whether quantitatively we can find distinction. The same problem applies to topography of river channels, and most commonly the most ubiquitous channel form is the meandering channel here. Those who have attempted to bring the meandering channel into the flume quickly find out if you put in sand and run water across it, it'll become braided. It'll have multi-threads. And it has been argued by many that that's because there is a strength, a bank needs strength to be able to meander and not just spread out and become braided. And in many, many cases on this planet, that strength comes from vegetation. This is beautifully shown by experiments by McCall Tall and Chris Paola, who patiently added alfalfa to their large flume and took a braided channel and had it evolve into a single thread channel. Christian Broderick has followed up on that and has, with patience, produced the first meandering channel with cutoffs that stays a single thread over a long duration by having strength in the banks and by having some fine sediment to fill the backs of point bars. Does this mean that when we look at a large river like this in Papua New Guinea, that's 300 meters across, that the tropical rainforest here is important to it being meandering? Do we need bank strength from vegetation to define meandering in this way? Well, we look now to other planets. We look to Mars and we see a meander in a delta into a crater lake with a beautiful cutoff loop where we clearly don't have vegetation, but we might have strength associated with frozen banks, and it's even carrying coarse sediment, making it even more challenging to explain. The high-rise data is displaying remarkable meandering channels with floodplains on Mars, or plains anyway, adjacent to them. Meandering in plains is becoming more widely recognized on Mars. Mars is becoming more familiar. Titan, meandering. 3,000 meters beneath the sea, meandering. Now, Leopold Langbein and Langbein-Leopold recognized this. They didn't have as much information about other planets, but they knew about the sinuosity of the Gulf Stream and the sinuosity of water down the windscreen on your car, as well as the sinuosity of channels, and argued, well, there must be a commonality that is the minimization of energy expenditure they proposed, and proposed a sign-generated curve that would describe that. And this does do a reasonable job of describing some forms of meandering. But when we look at the beautiful sinuous channels or water stream of water flowing down a plastic pipe, no sediment involved here, no erosion, or we see the cutoff loop on Mars, or we see the meandering loops beneath the sea associated with turbidity currents, we want to know about the mechanics that distinguish these processes. We would also like to have metrics that could compare them. We would like to be able to do calculations that, as Santao has done, evolve meanders transport sediment, evaluate the influence of sediment supply, form floodplains, and ask what happens when flow and sediment supply change in some way, climate change, land use, etc. We also want to understand the deep mechanism responsible for these instabilities. And Seminara, in a paper in JFM in 2006, does a wonderful summary of the origins of instability in fluvial meanders. So what I will conclude in looking at this first shock of the similarity of landforms, the ubiquity of landforms, is, to me, it's a shock to see the similarity. But what we are also looking for is the metrics that explicitly link process and form, and mechanistic theory to model the differences between landscapes, how they respond to the changes in their drivers, and what might lead them to be fundamentally different in a way. Now, the next topic I'll talk about is geomorphic modeling, and I want to emphasize that this section is I'm going to spend the most time on and explore with you. And I want to distinguish geomorphic modeling from modeling geomorphologists. And talk about this shock. We lack the constitutive relations and transport expressions for many geomorphic processes. I'm going to, at the persuasion of my students, I'm going to use this metaphor to illustrate the point, because it actually has a lot to do with the approach to the problem. And this is a personal journey, and this is an experience that our research group has come to. Here is a painting by Courbet of a canyon in France that shows tremendous detail. There are boulders, there's little patches of sand, there are fractures in the rock. This kind of landscape we could not predict with current knowledge about geomorphology starting from some initial rough surface. But society would like us to say a lot about this kind of landscape. Society would like to say, where would we put more wood for spawning for salmon? Where can we put a house that won't get hit by a landslide? How high will the flood go? And if we can inform our models with a lot of information, such as the channel cross-sectional geometry and slope, we can do some calculations. But we are not ready yet to make this kind of detailed calculation. I want to call this detailed realism. If we have hopes of talking about the future of landscapes, we have to move toward this capability. But we're not there yet. We can work with assistance from knowledge about the place. I want to contrast that with this. This is what I've called apparent realism. And in this case, we take our conservation laws, or we take a conservation equation and solve it by a series of rules that produce a landscape that produces ridge and valley topography, and say, well, this looks pretty good. But if you look more closely at this, you see impossibilities occurring. You see dissimilarities between the model and the landscape of interest or natural landscape. And you get an apparent realism. It looks to the eye right, but in detail, it really isn't what's going on. And so this presses two things: better knowledge about mechanics and better knowledge about metrics of how to distinguish landscapes. Now, to many of you, this may not look like a landscape, but it is an expression of one, in that we can think of landscapes as things in some kind of spatial organization, channel networks, the pattern of different types of channels across the landscape, the slope distribution. And there is a great interest, as I've already suggested in the first part of the talk, in the statistical relationships of things, in the distribution of things in space in the most general sense. And I've called this statistical realism, the pursuit of the commonalities of features. I want to distinguish that with this view by Cezanne, which I'm suggesting is essential realism. Here we see a particular landscape. Here we see a hill slope or a mountain and a plain below. We don't see houses in great detail or the details of rivers and valleys, but we see essential features that we would like to be able to explain. Why is there a plain? How high is the mountain? What's the width of the mountain? And I suggest to you that this is a kind of scale of interest for which we can have some hope of addressing. And it's a kind of scale of interest that we might look for explanation of differences, of the influence of lithology, of biology, of climate on what we look at. So this view then says that we need to look at our conservation equation. Now what I've written here is elevation change is a function of uplift, erosion of the rock if it's exposed, and the spatial gradient of sediment, whether it's colluvium or alluvium on the surface. This box then defines simply mass conservation, and to solve it, well, we turn to our tectonic friends to give us the uplift field. We need initial and boundary conditions for the problem, and we need what we can call as geomorphic transport laws. And by that we mean mathematical expressions that have physical meaning, that have parameters that are identifiable, have units that we can evaluate by either physical experiments or by field measurements, and that operate, that can be used to explain the evolution of landscapes. So it's the hypothesis is there are such things as geomorphic transport laws that are sufficiently mechanistic that we can explore this question of differences and causality. And I will say that an overly grand statement is that this is all of geomorphology in one equation. And I want to emphasize that I don't pretend here to speak for all of geomorphology. I speak for a view of how to link process and form, and I'm putting this in the context of these four shocks here today. So I want to take you on a journey now about solving the conservation equation by identifying geomorphic transport laws and the difficulty engaged in that. Well, this idea is nicely illustrated here by Tucker and Slingerland of we want to transform our landscape into some kind of numerical model, and we have to identify a series of processes of tectonic uplift, of weathering of rocks, of the transport of material on hill slopes, of bedrock incision into channels. So we list the different processes, and then we try to do experiments, field measurements to sort this out. Let me illustrate this, if I can push, with a cartoon. Here is a representation, a conceptualization of a landscape in the Oregon Coast Range where I've spent many years. And you see here a slice across the landscape with bedding here, a deep-seated landslide scar this way, a channel network established. We walk up this channel to here, expand that, walk up this valley axis, up to the ridge, and get to this point here. The erosional process begins by turning rock into soil. We need a production function for that. That material moves down slope by some set of processes, in this case by things like mountain beavers and tree throws that move material down slope. It accumulates in the low points, and at some point there's sufficient pore pressures from storms to destabilize that as a landslide of some specific size. That mobilized material runs down the canyon as a debris flow, entraining material and cutting the canyon, depositing material down here which is picked up by the fluvial process and takes that sediment as tools and bangs away in the bed and cuts the canyon. Let me summarize the transport laws I need to do this problem. I need a production function for soil. I need a transport process to move material to the valley axis. I need a landslide law to set the scale. I need a debris flow incision law, and I need a fluvial incision law. That, to do this problem with these scale-dependent processes at a mechanistic level, we'd like to be able to identify, quantify, and apply all these expressions. Now, if we take a step back in this view, though, and say, well, what does this transport law perspective teach us about landscapes? This was first best articulated by Smith and Bretherton in 1972. And they said, consider two kinds of transport laws. One that's just dependent upon slope, and one that has a slope and a discharge dependency, with discharge clearly increasing with increasing area down slope, increasing length from the slope. So in the first case, if you put a simple transport law of sediment proportional slope into our conservation equation and set it with a constant lowering condition, you will take a plane, and as it cuts down on both sides, a steady state form will emerge, which is a convex hilltop. And it will drop then unchangingly like this. If we perturb it in some way by mathematical perturbation or put grooves into it, the concentration of transport toward the low points will remove that, and the perturbations will damp out. And we can think of this as a diffusive behavior. In contrast, the solution for the general solution for the shape of a hillside where water transport matters is concave up. And if we perturb it, because there's more water transport toward the perturbed region, it cuts more. So it's unstable and perturbations grow. Right here, you can see the fundamental reason why there's ridge-and-valley topography. Concentrated processes, advective processes, cut canyons, And the slope-dependent processes smooth the places in between. And it's the competition of those processes that give us the thing we see. So we can write an expression like this. This was beautifully illustrated recently by Taylor Perrin, who, where's the little thing? Is he going to do this? Uh-oh, this is the first disappointment of a Mac. This is supposed to be a beautifully, rapidly changing landscape, and I'm worried about the other movies coming up that this doesn't happen. I spent about an hour loading these movies in this morning on a PC and uttering PC every time I looked at somebody. But apparently I wasn't sufficiently persuasive. So here is an erosion law with a diffusive term and some kind of advective term. And we can look at the intensity of this process by looking at the ratio of the diffusion and advection. Oop. Is there hope? Is it happening here? Okay. No luck. Okay. I'm really worried. We tried it out here before the talk began. It did everything nicely, sir. Here is various realizations of increasing the advective term. And what you see is an emergence of a wavelength scaled by the relative intensity of diffusion to advection. You see the wavelength getting shorter and then bifurcations beginning as the intensity with increasing intensity of dissection. So now we see region valley topography and some first order scaling about it associated with the relative intensity of these two processes in a quantitative way. So we can write this equation, get that topography, but still I have not really said anything about processes here. What are those actual processes that are doing the transport, that are doing the channel incision, and are these the best expressions for this in every case? So we can go back to the production function and do a slice through a hillside, and just writing the conservation equation for this single 1D problem is rather impressive. We have soil, we have weathered rock, we have bedrock. And there's an evolving process of flux down the hillside, conversion of rock to soil, lowering of the weathered bedrock interface, or if you like, as the rock is advected up through it. We have this evolving surface of the Earth, which is now referred to as the critical zone from here up to the top of the trees. And if I were to write a series of conservation equations, I could write one for the surface, for the soil, and for the weathered bedrock thickness, the yellow zone here. And look what it identifies. We need a transport law, if you like, or a expression that converts rock to weathered rock. We need a similar one for converting rock to soil. We need an erosion law, a chemical erosion law that explains how things vary spatially. We need it for the subsurface. We need it for the soil. And we need, of course, a transport law of the sediment across that landscape. So just this simple problem identifies many transport expressions that we need to know to solve it. Well, if you reduce that problem to just the problem of explaining the relationship between soil thickness, erosion, and transport, throwing out the dust, that equation simplifies. And if I focus now on the divergence term here, we can see that a simple balance must emerge, that the spatial gradient of sediment transport is balanced by either the changing thickness of soil or the production of rock from below. Thanks to the introduction of cosmogenic radionuclides, it's now possible to measure the production rate of rock to soil, the conversion of rock to soil. And this is something Arjun Heimsath has done. And here's a summary of some of his data showing the increasing the production rate as a function of depth and showing a strong dependency of that production rate on the thickness of the soil. Something that G.K. Gilbert speculated about in the 1870s and something now we can finally measure. And a reasonable approximation for many of these cases is that there's an inverse exponential function of soil production with depth, as one might expect if it's biogenically driven, because as that boundary gets farther away, the frequency of contact with the biota declines. So that we have now a way to talk about the production of soil and the transport of soil down the hillside. Well, first cut was to say, let's say it's proportional to slope, and here we can see a mechanism that could do that. Gophers, gopher mounds. You can see here this is California. There's a California state flower. There's a California state shoe. Now, if you take that expression and put it in a conservation equation and assume steady state for simplicity, you get an analytical solution for form. It's extremely powerful. It says that the height of this ridge is, versus its length, that ratio, if you like, depends on the relative intensity of incision, uplift, and diffusion. That the shape of the hillside is an expression, the curvature, in fact, is an expression of the ratio of those two terms. So we have a wonderful outcome. We could ask, is this term here in some explicit function activity, and is this analysis complete? And the answer is it's not, and it's getting, we're learning many things as we go along. Whoops, let's see if I can go back here. Yes, uh-oh, I'm in the do not go forward, backwards, or... Are you switching to a PC? I'm on the black control. Does this mean that everything will work? I was almost thinking about getting a Mac. My wife has a Mac. Okay, so this is so exciting. Oops, now I'm going backwards. Oh, you're doing this or am I doing this? Oh, okay. This is good. Isn't that exciting? This is fun. So this was done by Taylor, and he sped it up. You can see that was 600,000 years, going by really fast, almost as fast as I speak. Are we going forward or backwards? We're going backwards. Okay, am I on my own now? The PC is not working. Can we do this together somehow? Okay, let's just pretend we're on this slide. Here is a, actually I wouldn't mind going back one because it doesn't, there, just, that's beautiful. Okay, we're on this one. Here's sediment transport versus gradient. Josh Vuring and Jim Kirshner hypothesized an expression that looks like this from a theory about energy expenditure during dilational disturbance of the ground. This is not a correlation, it's a mechanistic hypothesis. And then went out to the field using cosmogenics, nuclide dating to get erosion rates, and did experiments to show support for the expression of this term, and then behind there is flume experiments to show also support for this expression. So we can, this is an example of a geomorphic transport law where this is testable in the field, it's testable in the lab, and these terms here, critical slope and that K term, have physical meaning. Do I push a button next, or do you push a button? Or do we just hope for the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so if I look at this graph, then we can open up that box, as Kyung-Soo Yu did, and discover that inside the box, the dilational disturbance could be done by organisms, and that you could propose that K term is a function of population density of the thing causing a dilational disturbance, and that it's proportional to power expenditure by the boater in doing the work. So he specifically went to the field, measured soil thickness and curvature, and measured the population distribution of gophers across the landscape and its dependency on soil depth. And if he adds that correction into the Vuring type law, he gets a better fit to the expression. He also says, click. Going back to the PC. Oh, okay. That surprisingly, 1% of the gopher power expenditure goes to sediment transport. I don't know if we can get them to work harder. That's a pretty low efficiency. But that's a number. And then transport law with N dependent, that is population dependency on soil thickness, gives a better fit. That is,
okay, this little wheel just pulled towards you. Like that.
That wheel or my wheel?
Your wheel.
My wheel. Oop. Well, that's a good thing. Gophers matter. Okay. Let's see what happens when the movie comes out. Do you want to stay nearby? Okay. So, animals. It wasn't the intent when we went out to the field. Our community, went out to the field. But animals said, we matter. And we matter in the production, and we matter in the transport. And you put those two together, as Josh and Arjun have done. Oops. And we can produce a map that takes a DM and predicts soil depth across the landscape. Testable. And there's support that this is sort of right. But we keep pushing. Example, Josh Vuring recently took real landscapes and modeled forward with various expressions of and modifications of the nonlinear transport law he described, and specifically proposed, well, you know, if it's bilateral, then there ought to be a depth dependency in that K term, and if you propose one, do you get a better fit? And he found the answer is yes. We could, I think a future direction that will be explored is to not start with a transport law like this, but start with the biota and do tree throw or animal burrowing active transport down the hillside and see if that sums up to the kind of expressions we see. So we're still pushing out the door, reaching toward the biology explicitly. Now if I move on, and I'm going to talk about other processes, I'm not going to talk about all processes, but I want to point out some. It is argued reasonably and correctly that the dominant process of eroding steep upland landscapes and landslides, and simply put, we don't have a transport law for it. I hope someone out here has an answer for me in a few years about what it might be. We don't have one. Surprisingly, the well-studied process of overland flow erosion, where we know that flux is proportional to an excess shear stress in some way, or it could be reduced to an area slope dependency. We know that describes things. We know it on kind of an event-based sheet wash measurement, but we don't have data to support a long-term geomorphic transport law of this overland flow process, the sheet wash process. We lack that yet. Still, there's important progress being made by the MIT group, Istanbuloglu and Collins, on bringing vegetation in, which surely matters to this, and trying to explore what might be the appropriate geomorphic transport law for this process. Landscapes are driven by river incision. There's three primary processes that do that. There is the banging away of particles as sediment crosses over it by river incision. There is cutting by debris flows that sweep down the canyons that I described, and there's also upward propagating nick point migration. Each of these are different processes requiring different mechanisms and different laws and having different expressions, we think. So the first one out was a proposal that a stream incision is proportional to a shear stress or a stream power per unit bed area, the simplest cut you can make. It turns out to be a surprisingly productive and instructive cut to make. That is, if we replace discharge with area and width with drainage area and assume that incision rate and uplift rate are comparable for the simplicity of getting an analytical solution, we get a beautiful analytical solution, which is that slope is an inverse power law of drainage area, in which the exponents here have meaning. They're the exponents on these transport processes. And the intercept has meaning. It's a relative ratio of uplift to this, if you like, erodibility of the bedrock. And people have used this very productively to search for things like faults, to characterize the slope-area relationships that might express progressive change in the uplift rates. It's been a valuable tool for investigating landscapes. But you could ask the question, whoops, where is the sediment in this? I really didn't say anything about it. But if we look at rivers, and the process I described, sediment plays a major role in cutting them. And this is something that Leonard Sklar explored with proposing river incisions being proportional, dependent upon three interacting processes: the erosion per impact, the number of impacts per time, and the amount of area exposed of the bed that can be eroded. And he proposed various mathematical expressions for that process, and then performed experiments in these whirliometer things where he spun the sediment around, got erosion rates, and plotted erosion rate as a function of sediment supply, and found, to our surprise, that at first the incision rate increased. And increased because of what you could call Toole's effect of the particles, more and more particles, more and more wear. But here, a greater and greater proportion of the bed surface is covered with sediment to the point where there's no erosion. And you can see that pattern here in that last bottom. This red line is the theory. So here we have a model that includes another attribute of the interaction between flow and sediment transport in landscapes that says the proportion of the bed area covered by sediment matters and the relative amount of sediment matters. And several groups have gone off to explore how this might have large-scale consequences in the feedback between climate, uplift, and tectonics. So opening that window a little farther opens up new possibilities of insight and connections. And the surprising outcome in Leonard's work is that despite, even in steep channels with fairly sparse coverage of sediment, if we look at the relative slope contribution from the three things the river does, it has to move the sediment that comes in, it has to carry away the sediment, and it cuts bedrock. And of course, it doesn't think this, it does this in a feedback way. It turns out for a wide range of uplift rate, the primary slope control is grain size, even in fairly bedrock-rich channels. from this model perspective. And secondarily is this influence of sediment supply, and then even less so is erosion. So it might, erosion to the bedrock, so it might be that the linkage between tectonics and uplift and erosion and river incision might come through these terms more than that term. More to be seen by the people in this room working on this. Now, nick points. This has turned out to be a very difficult problem to solve because it's almost a geomechanical problem at times. One approach that Mike Lamb has developed is to build upon the work of Sklar and others and to look at a case in Hawaii. In Hawaii, there's a cliff here that formed by a massive landslide, forming an instantaneous boundary that then, in a period of time, propagated back up these canyons and did so by propagating nick points. And by visual inspection, you can see that the walls of these nick points are actually drilled by burrowing sediment. And he proposed that the lateral migration, the nick point propagation, was controlled by this burrowing rate, which is therefore influenced by sediment supply, and developed a model to predict the lateral migration. A beginning point, nick point migration. Much yet to be done on that problem. Rivers also are cut by debris flow incision. And John Stock observed that debris flows come off the uplands area, sweep down, engage material, cut down into bedrock, and sweep to a lower proportion. And inspecting now the slope-area relationship that we expect to exist from the fluvial process, consistently there's a break. We tend to think it's around 10% and above. Others have made their placement elsewhere. But there's a scaling break. And the scaling break seems to be a signature of process change. And that process change from field observation is from fluvial incision to debris flow incision. So we need a debris flow incision law. John speculated that the incision should somehow be proportional to the inertial stresses that is imposed by the debris flow. So Leslie Shee did rotating drum experiments and a small drum that we've called whimsically the Maytag, in which she put in rotable materials, and this is a non-dimensional erosion rate, against a non-dimensional inertial stress, and found that, in fact, there was some kind of power law relationship between inertial stresses and erosion. It was the beginning point. We're now, oh, here comes the magic again. There. And there's a movie that might happen. If I do this, or do you do this? Where's the thing? Okay. So, whoa. Wonderful. We have now a 4-meter diameter vertically rotating drum that we're inspecting the internal dynamics of the flows and measuring stresses and measuring slopes to try to understand the mechanics of this process better. And behind here is another one. And this is a look-down view. The first shock of putting mixed grain materials in is the grains immediately segregate, not just at the front, but laterally, perhaps being the origin of levees. And that there's a tremendous difference in the stresses at the boundary created by these particles, and the mean stress is that's just the depth times the slope of this material on the boundary is okay, but it's the excursion stresses created by these pounding rocks that seem to drive erosion. Empirically, there's evidence for that. So we're then collaborating with, this is really exciting if this works. Okay, so this is a numerical model by our colleagues in Minnesota, Johans and Hill, that are now doing distinct element modeling to move away from the continuum approximation and to look at the collective banging of the boundary by different sized particles and the segregation that's associated with mixed grain sizes like this. And here up here is a measure of the differences in forces for different grain sizes on the boundary. We see this as perhaps a necessary direction to go to get the inertial stresses right and to figure out how then to calculate what the inertial stresses are, the collisional stresses on the boundary as these large rocks assault their bed during channel incision. So if we look back on this, we have this third shock. We have a conservation equation. And that conservation equation defines a need to have expressions for how rock is eroded and how sediment is transported across landscapes. And currently we have beginnings, just beginnings. Many processes we haven't anything for yet. And it's a particularly humbling experience to stand and look at the east side of the Sierra. Presently, we have nothing to tell us what the erosion rates are there and how to predict its evolution. I think this will change with the revolution in our field, but we can't do that problem yet because we don't have these erosion laws, these transport laws for that problem. This is a great opportunity. This is a great excitement to open up this box, solve this equation, and move forward. So the third shock I want to talk about is one of deep connections, of the interdependency of climate, tectonics, and topography. And these three landscapes, I would suggest to you, are pretty similar looking. The coast ranges of Taiwan, the Oregon Coast Range, and the Atacama Desert. Yet they differ in the rate at which they're operating by a factor of 5,000. 5,000. Yet they have ridge and valley topography. They're even soil mantled. So looking at this, you do want to stop and ask the question of how are tectonics, climate, and landscape evolution linked? Visually, it's not, you can't look at it and say, yep, that's really fast there, that's really slow, because we see this surprising similarity at hugely different rates of processes here. Well, I want to point to the larger scale of this and the deep connection that's been extremely stimulating by the group that's brought this forward, particularly Sean Willett, where they pointed out that when plates collide, there are large stresses that develop, and that force balance is affected by the unloading that's caused by erosion in a significant way, in a first-order way. That when rains approach a mountain system, they often do from one side or the other. So here's rain approaching from one side. And if we make the argument that where it rains more, it erodes more, then we'd expect an asymmetric removal of material from the mountain system, and that has deep consequences. Here's a numerical model result that has found various kinds of support from extensive field studies. Here, the red line is the mountain system, the precipitation variation across the mountain front, and the calculated exhumation of rock that's taken place. So here's that same thing. This is the net, the numerical mesh that's moved. And I think of this as erosion whales. You can see the mouth there. And you can see that if you follow a rock, it goes past the divide and ends up over here. The strange notion then is that the water draws the rock to it. It's not just that rivers cut canyons. They actually change the force balance and draw the mass to it. And this erosion process, depending on how it's distributed, depending on the amount, affects the height, width, and symmetry of mountain systems. And it actually is a way of connecting vegetation to whole mountains, because as vegetation affects the distribution of precipitation across the planet, so does it affect precipitation on mountains, so does it affect this balance. So we see very deep connections of what kinds of minerals are found at the surface of a mountain system based on where the erosion is taking place and at what rate. Now the final shock, our revolution. This is one I've shown you. It's the publication rate change, if you like, with the amount of publications in the word geomorphology in the Web of Science, just as one metric of an increased activity in the field. In this last few years, we've had the formation of the NSF program in geomorphology and land use dynamics. There is the 3 critical observatories that are just getting launched in the Sierra, in Boulder, in Colorado, in the Boulder Creek area, and in Pennsylvania, in the Shale Hills. We have the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping to obtain high-resolution topographic data. We have the PRIME Lab and the CAMS Lab at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory for doing accelerated mass spectrometry to get us rates. We have the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics to try to link biology, ecology, Earth surface processes to the basic science of landscape processes as well as restoration processes. And we have the new Journal of Geophysical Research, Earth Surface, which has been steered to great productivity by Bob Anderson and now Mike Church. We have ebooks, the generosity of our field. Bob Anderson put out the little book of geomorphology, which is not little in content, it's just thinner. And then Parker's wonderful ebook of 1D morphodynamics of rivers that's freely available on the web. And then we see books that have just come out, the quantitative modeling of Earth surface processes by Peltier, and Bob and Suzanne's long-awaited book, I hear coming, Geomorphology, Mechanics, and Chemistry of Landscapes. I can add that we've had something like 37 new faculty appointments, many of which may be in this room, in this field in the last 3 years. So we see a dramatic change, dramatic growth in the field. And I must advertise for our new chair who sits to my left that there's now an AGU focus group called Earth and Planetary Surface Processes, that meets today at 6:30 at the Marriott Hotel Golden Gate A3 room. Mike Ellis will be holding his ring up to touch. And so, right, Mike? And so the field is going through a revolution. I come at this having entered the field in the early 70s and seen an amazing change. I do not have to explain to my petrology friends anymore why we do what we do. To all my petrology friends in the audience. It's a revolution, and the revolution's on the upswing. We have so many opportunities, so many great discoveries to be made. So we have joined Langbein in his journey. And I will define from this personal journey 4 things that we're doing. 1, we seek metrics to distinguish landscapes, natural, experimental, numerical, distinguish them, find the differences. We seek geomorphic transport laws that explicitly include the effects of climate, geology, and life. None of that's in there yet, really. We have so much to do here. We seek connections over deep time and deep space between Earth surface processes, climate, tectonics, and the evolution of life. And necessarily, we seek collaboration with other fields to meet these challenges, to reach out to biology, climate sciences, etc. Now, one expression of the field is this one that we were fortunate enough to get a cover of Nature a couple years ago, in which we posed a question that got reworded here: is there a topographic signature to life on Earth? And note that the associated topics with this are flu virus and human empathy, extrasolar worlds, and nature jobs. So we're associated with these kinds of questions. Well, my wife and Chris Piola thought there's a better way to define this. So note that in flu virus, is geomorphology the cure? Human empathy, do geomorphologists have more? Extrasolar planets, are geomorphologists there as cute? Well, you can see who wrote that one. And then finally, nature jobs, become a geomorphologist and see the worlds. Thank you. Truly wonderful.
I don't know about you, but I want to thank Bill for a truly wonderful talk. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions from the audience, and it's hard for us to see, so if you're holding up a hand, shout or something.
Oh, John Selk. Hi, John.
What about groundwater and the fact that the water has to get to the surface or I'm surprised to see no reference to hydraulic conductivity or transmissivity or how the water goes from precipitation out to the river that included the groundwater side. It seems to relate to geomorphology.
I'll repeat the question I was asked. I guess there's the world outside can't hear you. So what about the role of groundwater and the properties of the Earth that affect the flux rate and all the things that water does? Here's my great chance to say that I see hydrology in the service of geomorphology. But really, you're absolutely right. And if we want to, if I would point back to my diagram of where I showed the layers, the soil, the weathered rock, and the bedrock, and say that all the water fluxes, all the chemical erosion is clearly associated with water paths and rates. And the pore pressure development that occurs that then destabilizes slopes is a hydrologic problem. So I would argue to you, I completely agree with you that the role that water is central. It drives landscape evolution, drives hill slope evolution, and we need to have it come in explicitly rather than it be in an inferred term on some flux law. And that's a big challenge. For example, one that we've pondered a lot is is to move toward this problem of the size of a shallow landslide. If we want to get a landslide law, we have to know size, and size is affected by the distribution of water that develops a certain level of pore pressure. So to do that problem right, we have to do the hydrology right to get the spatial pattern of pore pressures. So I totally agree with the sense of your question, and I see that hydrology is something that we have to do to get, as I say in the service, to get the fluxes right, the pressures right, the timing and pattern right. And, you know, in my case, we're on our third multi-year campaign on a tiny bit of hillslope to explore that. So I totally agree with the thrust of your statement. And you might say it might be a fourth thing missing, because I didn't say I had geology, climate, and life. You could say, well, explicit hydrology. I agree with you. And there's some people in this room who are exploring that rather well, who are trying to think of how to bring the dynamic stochastic hydrology into the driving process.
Another question? Slow-mo?
Phil, can you tell us a little bit about the metrics? What will be the metrics that we might be able to rely on in the future?
Yeah, the question is about metrics. What can we rely on? I will admit, in preparing this talk, I'm in a bit of turmoil about this. I think I know, and then I'm not sure I know. But I'll tell you what people have proposed and explored with some success. One very powerful metric is the slope-area relationship. And it's interesting that it's a power law relationship with scaling breaks, so it very nicely is a nod also to those who focus on scaling issues and recognize that scaling breaks mean something. And what we have found, and others have found, is that when you do slope area analysis of river networks, the scaling breaks tend to discover or point to process change, whether it's the debris flow fluvial incision or it's bedrock incision to alluvial transport. And there seems to be characteristic exponents on that m over n, if you like, or what Whipple calls the concavity term, that are meaningful. And they differ from those sandbox experiments. So we think that is revealing, that the fact that we get different kinds of exponents in sandbox experiments suggests that those experiments, while visually similar, are actually not telling us the same thing about Earth surface processes. So there's one. Another metric that is a motivator is if you define the finest scale of dissection that I described, the wavelength between that. One thing that distinguishes landscapes is drainage density. And drainage density is controlled by where channels begin. And something determines the occurrence of channel initiation, a physical thing. So some places have few channels and some places have many channels. If you have many channels, you result in a high drainage density. And wavelength is related to the number of initiation points of the fine scale. So another metric is the wavelength of valleys, or another, if you like, where channels begin. And that does seem to distinguish landscapes. All channels have to begin somewhere. And where they begin, mechanics of that set an upper scale region. So there's another metric. Others have explored, and I don't know yet, whether there are distinguishing aspects about channel networks. My colleagues, Ignacio Rodriguez-Cuturbi and Andre Rinaldo, have argued for certain aspects of the distribution function of area as you accumulate drainage area downslope that has a signature to it. I don't know if that's a distinguishing criteria, but it is distinctive about fluvial landscapes. Neiman and Hosberger found some subtle differences in the slope-area relationship and also the relationship between tributaries and the main stem in terms of there was a tendency in those sandbox models for the channels to be anomalously steep when they were near the main stem as compared farther away, and things like that. Subtle. So I would say that those are the network properties are still being explored as what might be distinctive. But I can hang my hat on the slope area thing, I think, and channel initiation. Those we know have mechanistic signatures. And I challenged, there might be more hands that come up and say, I have some others that might work, and we need them. We need them. I saw Mike wave his hand.
Another question.
Could you hand me some water, John? Mike? Yeah.
I suggest one thing you did not mention about everything. There's one of the very interesting aspects of landscapes is that they have a point time, not a point time event. And that makes our system both more interesting and more difficult than other systems, like, for example, the atmosphere. So we are trying to
I'll attempt to restate it so all can hear it. Mike pointed out that landscapes have history. All landscapes have history. Some more eroded than others, or removed than others, and that results from response time. They're a certain scale. The driving functions operate at certain time scales, and transitions take time to take place. And those, so when we examine landscapes, we have to wrestle with deeper time in all cases. And I completely agree. I guess when I was trying to identify shocks, I didn't find that so much a shock as a worry, but very real. And in fact, some have argued that it's the non-steady transition landscapes that might reveal more information about how landscapes work. The puzzling problem that people pointed out that if you take all the cosmogenic radionuclide data, erosion rates, and you plot it against precipitation, there's no relationship. The erosion rate is not related to precipitation, it's just blindly. Is that the wrong kind of plot? Because maybe the driver is uplift and precipitation varies, and what results is response function is topography, not erosion rate, for different uplift rates. For different climatic regimes, excuse me. So I agree with you that this legacy issue and deep time matters, and landscapes have a deep history. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Shock for me is working in the western U.S. has always been how pervasive the effect of wind is on geomorphology. So I'm curious if you didn't mention that because it's insignificant or because your view is more dictated by human environments.
Well, I can hide behind the shield that I said this is a personal journey. Oh, sorry, question. He asked me what my, he said he's impressed in the West of the influence of wind on landscapes. And I will admit that I've spent most of my research time along vegetated landscapes. I have spent, thanks to Ron Amundsen, 4 summer seasons in Atacama. There's no doubt there are places that wind really dominate. And I completely agree with you. In the places I've looked, I've tended to work in places that was not important. But and I want to emphasize let me use your statement to say that, again, I want to say that I didn't try to cover all processes. I said nothing about glaciers and glaciation or periglacial. These are important processes, but I tried to highlight some issues that I would argue to that the issues I've raised are applicable to landscapes where other processes dominate. But it's a shock to you that the wind is so important, is what I think your point is. And I take your point.
A question about the central role of geomorphic transport laws and to what degree that is a matter of fact versus a matter of faith.
Okay, go ahead.
Particularly in the case of strongly advective processes where momentum conservation is playing a large role in the physics of the process, why would you expect a priori that there would be such a thing as a transport law? Why wouldn't it depend on the entire physics of the process that is nonlinear in the case of an advective process? And why would that all average out into a transport law?
Dick has asked, I'll try to phrase this right, and if I don't, have me repeat it. He's asking, why would I expect the transport laws and their average, the sense of it's an averaging, it works over time and therefore is averaging out things, be correct, and why wouldn't the full physics and the effects of dealing with momentum conservation, not just mass conservation, matters? Is that fair? Okay. I agree with the sense of your question, and I think that that's one of the doors being pushed open also, is to move away from sort of something that works smoothly over, long geologic times, and that people are beginning to open the door of, well, how would I even route sediment by stochastic events, by storm events? I think that's a great opportunity. I'm suggesting to you that the first cut has the hope of getting some grander, gross understanding of topography, and iteratively we can push open these doors. Push open the door of stochasticity, push open the door of hydrology, push open the door of climate biology and geology. I agree with the sense of your question entirely.
Yeah, I think we'll take 2 more questions before we bring this to a close.
There's 2 here. No. I'm not sure.
Bill, we know that biology has a first-order control on landscapes because of humans. We've utterly transformed the face of the earth. I'm
Let's see. Can I phrase this as following, Leonard? Your question is the importance that our field has to the fate of the planet. Is that too succinct? I think that's a major reason why many people in this room, and I agree with that too, I think that that's actually harder because it brings in the stochasticity, the event-based, the local, the hydrology. It's actually a harder problem to deal with the messiness of shorter timescales and the transient state. So the things that everyone's brought up are all the nasty things that I try to sweep back behind the curtain, and yet all of those things come out and are very important. And I agree with you that I think part of the revolution that's taking place in our field is because the enthusiasm that many young people have to address these problems and to make progress on them.
Last question. Just want to give
Oh dear.
Bill, you talk very powerfully about the importance of life in understanding geomorphic processes. And yet, it seems to me that as soon as you bring life into the equation, the complexities which you've described in just terms of physical terms proceed by orders of magnitude. I'm sure you've thought about it, but how do you bring life in a meaningful way to what you're doing?
Well, okay, the question is, life, when you add life to the equation, it gets orders of magnitude more complicated. And living with an ecologist, I know that's true. But I will, and I think that's, I like the example that Kyung-Soo Yu offered. I was saying, well, can we start with an expression and pull out the part that looks like it's got the life, it's got ears on it, and represent it some way? Is that too simple? But it does, if you do that, then you say, well, then the population densities matter, and then what controls population densities, and you can bring in competition and climate change and land use and the rest. I will admit that I've shied away from going much farther than this because as you explore it, you find it really difficult. But we have to tackle it. It's a frontier area that there are people in this room I know who are working on it. Manny Gabay sent me an email saying he's making progress on some aspect of tree throw. I think this generation will push forward. There was a very exciting MIRES meeting in New Orleans earlier this year, as you know, and great enthusiasm to take on this difficult bit. In some ways, maybe our generation had the luck of working some of the simpler stuff first. But maybe not the most important. We'll see.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay.